All right, fair enough, fair enough. All right, cool. So we're recording. All right. Shane, Lucas, thank you so much for being a part of this. And from what we were just talking about before, this is a moment to record stories, voices, message that you wish to have preserved. Part of the Transparency Project is to use art and design to elevate the voices of the community and have them portrayed in their own voice and light. So I have a series of questions, but we're totally open to talk about anything that you want to be heard and kept. So with that noted, I would love to hear more about yourself and what you do, and then we can go from there.
Oh, thank you. Jordan, again, thank you so much for including me as part of this project. I appreciate it very much. My name is Shane Lucas, he, him, his. And I've been an activist most of my life. I think it's been sort of a critical piece of my identity from when I was a teenager to now here in my mid 40s. And really having been in varying places within the movement, not just the queer rights movement, but really talking about everything from women's reproductive health to economic justice, racial justice. There's so many different areas that I think need to be lifted and made relevant and to everyone across communities. And so to me, I've definitely found my core, my center tends to be around queer identity and really wanting to make sure that when we talk about the queer diaspora, that we are inclusive of everyone and also, honoring both the legacy and making sure that we're keeping our eyes forward. I think it's very easy for people in movements to get comfortable, especially people who intersect at points of privilege, but not only. Sometimes people get comfortable with their own oppression. Sometimes people get comfortable in their own scenarios, and they kind of assume, well, this is the way it is. And I think if you look at many of the great leaders, many of the great voices that have been in this movement, as well as many others, you see that recognizing that you can honor where you're at and also advance forward has sort of been a big motivation for me, and that's really what I try to do and where I try to look at expending my time and my effort and my energy. And so I've been at this for a long time. And I love it.
Awesome. Yeah, and just kind of backtracking. So who are some of the people who are your role models and sort of who's inspired you along your path of activism?
I mean, there are so many individuals and so many people, because I think we oftentimes lift up the exceptions, and I think the exceptions are notable. The MLKs, there are definitely leaders. Sylvia Rivera. There are leaders within this movement and many others that I think are again important, and we recognize that their contributions have been significant. I think there are so many people, and I always think of it more collectively because it wasn't. There's individuals like Bayard Rustin, who's an important support to MLK, and oftentimes wasn't included in conversations around civil rights, even though he was an out gay, or at least had shared with many people in his community about his gay identity, and that was relevant to the way that he approached some of his own activism. And I think that there's other individuals throughout history that have contributed into those conversations. So again, I could list off Gloria Anzaldúa, for example, when it comes to Latina, and kind of the important work about the queer Latina movement, queer Latin movement. There's so many individuals and writers and contributors and people, and I think it's to me, like, if I were to look at people who were pinnacle, I would say there's writers like Alice Walker, who before it was popular. And I say popular, but to talk about sort of what it meant to be a Black woman and the challenges, and made her voice heard in spite of people not wanting to hear it, in spite of voices really trying to oppress that conversation. She just she was like, no, you will listen, and you will. Yeah, I'm going to make sure. But there's also again, Jamaica Kincaid. There's other writers who have all contributed into that movement. Cornel West, obviously, to me was just very powerful. Michel Foucault. From a theoretical standpoint, is somebody, and partially I really like Cornell and I like Michelle, partially because they not only took their sort of academic perceptions of the world and really the insights that they brought to those conversations, but they took it to the streets. So both of them, as well as many other, I would say, intellectuals who didn't just kind of hole up in the ivory tower and say like, oh, I can contextualize the way that society creates these points of oppression, the way that society creates and manifests itself and manifests that injustice. But I'm going to actually show up and do stuff. And I think I learned early on from those types of voices that you could expect more and demand more. And then on the ground, and I think I mentioned to you before, Patty, who was probably very formative for me in a very young age when I was 15 at Planned Parenthood. And so Patty, who had already survived cancer, was working in Planned Parenthood in rural Illinois, and they were bombing them and they were doing all this stuff, and she was like, no, I mean, you have to be here. Like I have the opportunity to be here, and I need to be able to do this work, and this work matters. And so later, when I would eventually come out, when I would start in, doing everything from HIV prevention to other areas around harm reduction, which, again, reproductive health work is oftentimes in a harm reduction model. Then, again, I would start to incorporate more and more of that. Like, yeah, you have to be here. You have to show up. What you have, that kind of capital, and that's not just money, but it's also your time, your effort, your attention. For those of us who intersect at points of privilege, whether it's with our education, whether it's our racial identity or gender identity, how we use that capital matters. And I think that's the kind of thing that just always came back to me with any of the writing. Pierre Bourdieu is a theorist, as a French theorist that I really liked. I sound very academic-y, and I'm really not. I have a bachelor's degree, like that's the extent of my education. But but I've learned a lot. Like, one thing I think you always really try to learn. So again, from today's leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Reverend Barber, there are just many individuals, Kyan Show out of New York. There's so many people who are out there doing things, and I think I learned from them. I learned from listening to them. I'm grateful to be in community with different people, and so I would say that all matters.
Yeah, so wow, a lot of cool stuff. You already blew through half my questions.
Then we have lots more to talk about. We're not
there's so much more to talk about. Thank you for that. Like, I want to backtrack a little bit, because the next question I really had, you already talked about, what caused you to be as an activist for the community, and then just like, what stories do you have to share? You've given bits and pieces. What you said, and I'm going to paraphrase, is this idea of where we intersect at different levels of privilege. And I think that's really important and interesting, because I don't know if people recognize the points of privilege that they have, not just with race, but also with gender, with socioeconomics, with even religion in some regard, depending what communities you're in or societies you're in. And so with all that mentioned, I think I'm going to alter my question. Instead of what stories do you have to share, do you have any profound stories about recognizing when and where you have privilege and how to leverage it? Because that's kind of where I'm at with this project. I'm not a cisgender. I'm not a transgender person. I'm a cisgender man, and so wanting to help and advocate, having to recognize where my privileges are and how to use that as a leverage to help people who aren't. Do you have anything to share for that?
I'm gonna have nothing profound, so I feel like I'm the lack of profound. But I will share with you story. I can certainly share stories, and one of my areas of specialty that I spent several decades in was around sex work decriminalization and awareness and education. And the reason I did that, like a core reason for that, is that for those of us who identify in the LGBTQ spectrum, around the gender identity, and gender expression spectrum, and sexual identity spectrum, we owe so much to people who worked within those communities, who worked as sex workers. They're oftentimes one of the most maligned communities, or most maligned identities, and yet make up billions and billions of dollars of capital industry. So many people have different points of contact with them, and queer people's points of revolution have often been dependent on them. And I think that's an important thing to always come back to. And I bring this up because I'm a white cis male with a college education, like all of these. And in that movement, the people who sort of have been sort of the foundation of this movement were trans women of color, were people who were not afforded many of the same opportunities I was afforded. And yet they showed up at Stonewall and ACT UP, at Compton's cafeteria riots, and at all these points that we really needed to stand up, where a lot of people just kind of hid to the shadows. And even, again, there's no way to put into words how much we need to honor those individuals, not just for their racial identities and cultural identities and many of the sort of depth and breadth of who they were, but that we oftentimes take this idea of sex work that was a really important sort of component for them to be able to maintain agency, and we don't talk about it. And I'm not saying we have to necessarily, lift it up and sort of, say that everyone needs to be working in that industry. It's rather that by not talking about it, we end up reoppressing communities that end up either choosing or feeling compelled to work in that industry, and we just sort of add layers of mess on top of it, rather than addressing any of the issues that we might need to do. And as queer communities, I think we need to be out there doing that. So as a white cis male, I'm kind of in an unusual spot in that regards. And so, coming back to that intersection, it's recognizing that as I was thinking about HIV prevention and how I can sort of work within the queer community, that was an area that I wanted to spend time, both because for my own biography, it was an important moment. And like many queer people, especially young queer people in that era, because I'm old. I guess we're about the same age. We're not too far apart, right? I can remember. I'm a little old. Anyways, so I'm in my mid 40s. So for many of us who were coming out in the early 90s, 80s, especially, throughout the history of the queer identity, oftentimes either fearing ostracization from your family, or feeling like you need to enact that level of independence and agency, a lot of people ended up working in that industry, and I was certainly one of them. And so, recognizing that there were no voices, there was very little support. And I shouldn't say no voices. There are certainly, again, a lineage. Nothing is without a lineage. This conversation isn't without a lineage. All of these. There have been trans community members, people of color within our community who have all led a lot of these conversations, but they have just not been heard. And so I think, again, it's a testament to the importance of your work, being out there, continuing to try and advance and get these out there, and get these conversations out there. So when I started working with that area of activism, it had been on a foundation of something called Horzine, and there was something called Danzine out of Teresa Dulce's magazine out of Portland. There were a variety of leaders, Annie Oakley, and then I could get into like Cindy Clay. There's so many individuals who I could not be more grateful for, that have been out there doing that work. And so there were few men. So I could probably count on one hand the number of men who were out in the industry doing that work. And so to me, recognizing my place, and trying to bring some intersectionality was to say, hey, how can I contribute with this? But also I don't want to take it over, right? So this is the history, unfortunately, of people in privilege entering these conversations. And I'm certainly not without flaws or my own, accountability. But I did try to be as conscious, and I continue to try to be as conscious as I can within organizing, because I think that's the challenge, right? You have to sort of, at some point, you're exerting a little bit of that social capital, but you have to be very conscious that you don't exert it to the point of either exclusion, and that you're really contributing to a broader conversation, lifting up other voices as you go through that process, or even just kind of being the foundation and support so that other voices have a chance to be heard. And learned from. Like, I couldn't have learned from other people if all I'd done was like, this is my way and I'm gonna make it happen. And I needed to listen and be like, is this what we need as a community, or this is what we're needing to do? And I think that's hard. I think it's something I'm still learning at 46. I'm certainly still learning to do. I'm certainly not flawless. But I work really hard, and even in the activist work I do today, it's very much informed by that. So in working within sex worker decrim and kind of working toward representation in that area, it was really about making sure that when we talked about the industry, we had conversations around what it meant to restore dignity. And I say restore dignity just means like people who worked in that industry were terribly, and oftentimes, like many movements, they were, so you get like layers of stigma, right? So there's stigma, there's racial stigma and gender stigma and all these ones. And so, sex worker stigma is its own challenge, and can be significant in that it also plays out like racial stigma in other areas. It can play out very pragmatically, very practically. So if you are a stripper at a place near the airport, and it is legal to be a stripper, that's totes legal, it's totes on the book, still get your kid taken away. So that can still be used as leverage to have your child taken away. That can still be used as leverage to get kicked out of your house. That can still be used as leverage to do so many things, and it's all within the parameters of the law. Because the law, maintains some very gray areas. There are obviously protected and unprotected classes, people who work in the adult industry, and again, that's a broad spectrum. They are not protected under anything. And so the stigma can actually manifest itself in such a way as that, yeah, you could be kicked off for doing a webcam model if you wanted to, in theory, right? Now, will everyone do it? No. Certainly in urban environments, you don't see it as often. But, if you're rural and you're trying to make money in, whatever, down economy, which is where we see a huge uptake within people in the industry, like, your protections aren't there. And for a lot of women who have children, particularly women, basically the issues around maintaining custody of your children is oftentimes one of the bigger concerns. So again, like these stigmas play out in different ways. In a gay culture, it's kind of a funny one because we create celebrities of people within the adult industry. I used to joke years ago that more people knew names of porn stars than they knew politicians, and it's not untrue, right? Having been around and know and be in community with several people who work in that industry, like there's a huge following, right? Millions of followers. And it's not unlike heterosexual culture, which also has its own celebrities. But we put them on the cover of our magazines, like our big ones, like our Outs and our Advocates and our whatever. Like we kind of venerate that experience. However, only for a short period of time. Like, talk to me about what it is to be an older person in that industry, or what kind of economic protections there were for people in those industries. And you won't find them. Again, we saw high suicidality. We saw high drug and alcohol usage. We saw high increased levels of depression. There was a study done with CUNY years ago that I was, actually, I think I co-wrote the intro, which was kind of fun. But amazing academics. I was not I was the non-academic, I think, on that thing. And I'm there for the fun. And but like the thing we wanted to sort of bring to light was really that the impact of that industry was so significant. So again, coming at it from an intersectional standpoint, it was, how do we take this conversation, which will cause harm, to bring into public light? And I say that as someone for whom it has caused direct and very significant harm to me personally, to bring into public space, professionally, in a variety of other ways. And part of my commitment to that is that again, I've been able to rely on other areas of privilege that have allowed me to sort of volley that differently. It doesn't mean it's not scary or bad, and other people will feel it far worse than I do. So that's the thing, is I think part of that risk, and so coming back again to that intersectionality, is part of that risk. There is a vulnerability in taking on issues like, again, racial justice. When we see all of those individuals out there for those Black Lives Matter parades, it's really important, and it's great to see a unified front out there, and especially when it is in these sort of cultural tenor, for a lot of people to feel that halo for being out there. The question is, will individuals be out there when it's not popular, when it calls out companies that they work for, when it comes into conflict with those places that do feel more comfortable? And I'm not saying that being out there and marching was not uncomfortable. It certainly was causing discomfort in a lot of different ways. But I think people with privilege have to learn to deal with discomfort. And it was a small amount of discomfort compared to the kind of discomfort that really needs to be had when we talk about cultural upheaval, when we're really changing things around gender identity and gender expression, for example. But also, again, racial injustice, economic injustice, other areas. And again, like, when I talk about sex work, lots of uncomfortability. I get it's a lot. So all of those things, to me, like, that's where you look at that intersectionality, is how can you manage and modify that discomfort? And that is something that I guess, again, I took on early as a, mentally, but not without balance. Like, I couldn't do this for 30 years. I know many activists who have spent their lives sowing discomfort, and they are gifts. I love them. They are people who I think I admire that level of consistent, like they're out there. I tried to find a balance. For me, I needed, if I was going to stay in this for the long haul and continue to push forward as much as I could and continue to kind of be at least a sort of a constant thread in support, I needed to also modify. So for me, I kept a personal balance and an activist balance and then a professional life separately. Only once did they ever intermix, and that got me into trouble. So
Great segue,
so,
because I wanted to ask you about what hardships have you faced in the course of your work.
I mean, definitely different ones. I'll use one example. There's one example I can't disclose too much about, but the other one. So I was at one point. Well, and this I have to be vague about too. So I once took a job. I was very upfront about my activism. It was a job totally unrelated to any activist work and that kind of thing. And I was working in web work at the. Actually, I still do, but I was basically working and kind of helping develop a new platform and a new product for a company and a publication that essentially had a high profile and even had a GLAAD sort of stamp of approval kind of thing on it. And at one point, they kind of Googled my history and then decided that they didn't like my activist work. And so I was terminated for that. I was terminated for that work, which again, without going into too many details, was settled quietly. But it was settled. But it was a shock. It was not the first time that I've ever had it come sort of bite me in the tail. Even though I disclosed that work ahead of time. Like, to me, I've always been very proud of it. In fact, for a long time, I used my real name, my birth name, in most of my work. And then that happened, and then I started using an AKA. So I used an AKA when I worked in the industry years ago, so it was kind of fun to go back to it. It felt like so retro. And I got to choose an awesome one, so that was cool. But I did end up using an AKA after that, because at that point I felt very exposed, and partially it was the evolution essentially of search engines. I guess, again, for those of us who are old enough to remember life before them, it was like, oh, and also I'm proud of my activist work. So I know it's controversial and not everybody will be into it, and that's fine. And wherever you stand on the industry, on the issue around decriminalization or even queer rights for that matter, I come from a place where, all people deserve dignity, and all people, even the most difficult choices. So whether it's women's reproductive health or sex work, or any of these things that I think are difficult choices. And it is not my place to tell you how to make those choices. That, to me, I always embrace this work because it was about anybody who makes those choices needs to have as much information as possible. And then you can talk about what support means and whether or not they can sort of move forward with the decisions that they have made. And so even as an activist, my goal was just like, I'm not going to tell you what you want to do with your life and whether you want to work in the industry or not. You're going to do it whether you like it or not. My goal is to get you in. If you're going to choose to do it, go in with your skin intact and come out with your skin intact, and then move on with your life in the way you need to. Because that was, especially in that era of HIV when I had started a lot of this work, our numbers were just not great, and they were not doing well. And so it was a way to sort of, again, facilitate that conversation. Now I think it's much more about the impact of stigma. I think there's still harms being done every day, especially when we talk about trans women of color in the industry, who are often the most maligned when it comes to law enforcement, and all of that. So anyways, so I would say, again, like this, as far as me, the stories go, certainly I will oftentimes in those conversations, I kind of use the metaphor. When I went for one job, I had a mohawk, right? So which I love.
You had the mohawk.
I mean, I love, I'm probably, I don't know if I'm too old for it now. Maybe if I thin down maybe 15, 20 pounds, I might do it again. But I will say, like, I went in for a job with a mohawk, and this is very much kind of a good metaphor or a good parallel to my activist work. I went in for a job with a mohawk, and I could have like, ooh, he's creative. He's whoa, look at that. And then they would sort of mind me for that. Like they would like, if there was a photo op, they'd be like, ooh, you want to see somebody creative? Because the rest of that firm was like, oh, boring white people. So they would like, no lie. And so they would like rush, they would take a photo with me and my computer, like, look at how creative he is. And like, would they give me the time of day, any other thing? No, not even, not it. I was never a serious person, but I was a help to them in their sort of image. Oh, are you okay? Okay. But if I were a person of color trying to get that job and I went in with a mohawk, if I were a woman trying to go into that job and I went in with a mohawk, there were lots of like, I'm able to sort of wield that in a way that becomes itself a form of capital. And as an activist, again, like I'm able to get into a room and I can be like, I want to talk about sex work. And at the time, like the reason I could get away with it was because they'd be like, look at this fine, articulate white guy saying something about sex work. And then I'd have to go, so let's talk about what your problems are and why you're not doing the things you need to be doing. Like, who's not in the room? So like, I always saw my job was to go in and be like, hey, look, here's where you're missing the ball. And here's where you're not talking about race. Here's where you're not talking about gender identity. Here's where you're not talking about these things. And this is why they need to be there. And so I took it, for me, it was just a way to sort of basically create discomfort in the space and be like, we're going to be uncomfortable and that's okay. So let's go. But people would get titillated initially because that's just the nature of talking about that work. But I think that they would be more open to it. And that was just, again, I think I traced that a lot back to I intersected so many places of privilege. But how I use that is trying to make sure that like we're talking about other stuff. That we are getting into these places that are uncomfortable. And I think that's where activists need to be is figuring out how do we, if we can use, that privilege to get in the door, then that's great. But we need to be able to use it for something. Like, it's not about us getting in the door. I could go on and on, but I mean, there's a recent project I can talk about too, where my whole goal was to not like, and I did not want to be at the front and center of it. I know there's one called Power Beyond Pride, which was a really a collaboration and an amazing group of people, all of whom who made that project possible. The initial idea, that initial sort of thing, sort of the genesis came from me, but also built on a legacy of other people who obviously and activists who have been working very hard to facilitate those conversations. And the whole thing was around community forums. So it's not a novel idea in that respect. It was really a novel idea, or I should say novel idea, was to try and build a coalition of disparate members of communities and be like, let's come together and let's do this thing. Y'all don't know each other, or some of you know each other. Let's all do something that we really are proud of, that we can work on. But it was also to make sure, and I wanted to try and make sure that I was not, and again, as the white cis guy and kind of trying to advance it, I didn't want to be at the center of it. And so it was a very conscious thing. So I would say the challenges, and certainly I'm not flawless. Like, it's hard not to be, especially I'm a little energetic. It's hard not to be wanting to push stuff forward and not wanting to sort of propel it or add some energy to it and not be seen as the person leading it. And I think that's the challenge, for at least for me, has always been, I have a generally gregarious personality. I'm a Leo through and through. And I care. Like, I think that's the part, at the end of the day, what fuels a lot of this work is I care. And so when I'm in those situations, it was really trying to be conscious about it, especially, again, taking in the insights from other leaders, from other people in the communities, and trying to listen to what they had said about how do you step back, how do you do all these things. And I don't know that I did it right, but I tried hard to figure out, like, how do you step back and how do you let it be kind of what it is, and let it, and that is painful. It is to my core, because I'm like, no, we need an order and organization, and we need dates, and I need like, what's the turnout? Like, what are we doing? And I think that's where my biggest, like, that's one of the areas of conflict that's really hard for me, is I'm like, well, let's go. And when you're working with community people across diverse communities who have all different sets of timelines and priorities and voices that need to be heard, spaces that need to be considered, reflected on, made safe for expression, especially if you're asking people to be vulnerable. Those are all things that, it's hard, but whatever, I'll do the work.
Fair enough. And, speaking of And that's actually that's a huge inspiration for me personally, because like growing up, that's very much one of my own personal principles about, don't talk about anything unless you're ready to do something about it, or like just walk your talk. And part of this project, I think about that throughout the entire process of it, of like, am I putting in the work? And going back to what you said earlier before, as far as advocacy work and everything, maybe not everybody has the courage to maybe march in the protests or don't have the money to donate to your organizations, but they can definitely talk to their peers. They can talk to their boss. They can advocate for somebody. They can go, if nothing else, go out and learn about the people in question. And, I think about that through every step of this project, even with what I'm doing right now with Laura and a few other folks. I think about, does this count as my contribution, and is this enough? And I don't even know if "is this enough" is the right word, but is this substantial, or of substance? And so I say all that because the next question I have really is like, for those who know nothing about transgender people but want to respect or be an ally, and just don't know, like, what's the first step for them to learn? And this can be for any form of advocacy, if that's a little bit easier to answer.
Well, I thank you for sharing that too about your own kind of going through. I want to address that really quick and say, well, as you said, there's never such thing as enough. I think the more you look at the legacy of conversations and work that has to be done and had to be done to get to this point, I think you recognize that, like, we are so far from any form of cultural equity, that we have, and maybe that's, I don't want to say good, but maybe it's good we look at what equity means and eventually have that conversation, that it won't mean that we treat everyone the same, right? It's not the same thing as equality. It's rather that we treat everyone with dignity, that everyone has opportunity, that all of these things are there. And so, I want to make sure there's diversity in the musics and the foods and the identities and the stories and all this kind of stuff. The issue is whether we are perpetuating suffering or we are, reducing the value of people. And I think that is to me the place that cultures can kind of come forward, because we will probably always be learning about each other because we are always learning about ourselves. And I think we have that work to do. And that goes across communities, right? Like, other queer people still have a lot to learn about other queer people. And I'm sure other Black people have a lot to learn about other Black people. And again, that broad diaspora of identities, even among Blackness, is complicated between Afro-Cuban and Afro-Latina and Afro-Latino. And like, there's so many different beautiful, rich variations and identities and stories in that. And we oftentimes want to compress them down to be like, oh, well, if we create equity for this population. And I think, again, sex work has certainly spent an area spent a lot of time, but not only, in other areas of queer justice. I love that I took to queerness because I love its diversity. I love this idea of a spectrum. And I think if you're asking where can people start to understand how they can be supportive around transgender and individuals who sort of identify across a broad gender and identity spectrum, it is to recognize that there is in fact a spectrum, and that spectrum is very fluid. That the things that we take as sort of like hard and fast forms of who we are have never been concrete. Like, what being masculine meant in 2020 is not the same thing what being masculine meant in 1780. It's not the same thing it meant in tribal, Africa. It's not what it meant in South America in 1700s. It's not what it meant in, like, all of these things live in varying different, like, constructions. And this idea of some sort of like formal, like, real men wear plaid, and I wear a lot of plaid. Like, no, like, none of that's baked in. Like, there's no DNA code that says plaid. None of that is baked in. Now, what I think is what I love about young people approaching their identities across this diaspora is that they recognize kind of both the temporal and also the sort of the again the richness of that diaspora. I think for individuals who are a little bit older, my age and a little bit older, I think there is still a strong adherence to binary. And again, for individuals of transgender experience who oftentimes really find that sort of binary very comfortable. I also understand that that's a hard, that's a difficult place to sort of process, especially younger people who sort of see a much more non-gender conforming, non-binary construction. Individuals who are, again, a little bit older have understood themselves in relationship to this sort of binary self and the way that most of us have. And so I think that, again, recognizing that spectrum is good for all of us across all communities. And that spectrum, I like to say, you are like who you are now is not who you were 10 years ago, right? Like if you do a little bit of self-reflection, and I'm not saying like, like you're, I don't know, like, I don't know, you now you speak French or you spoke French, now you don't, but like whatever, like you're just a different person. You've had different experiences.
Your worldviews have changed.
Your experience has changed, and your understanding and the kind of new concepts or evolved concepts or just different concepts that you have had to integrate into your worldview have shifted too, right? And also you're older, and there's different things that come with that. There's all of these things that happen. We are always kind of moving and evolving and shifting and growing, and I think that's what, as an activist, I also love, is that you don't have to be sort of set in one place. And even for members of marginalized communities, and again, I'll talk to queer people particularly, like we aren't free of the responsibility to continue that evolution. Like just because we've experienced oppression at any level doesn't mean we stop. And for people who don't experience oppression at all, I think it's even more paramount that they're reminded that they don't get to stop. Then to me, that's something across every community, and a place to start is that humility that you have to approach those conversations and say, look, I'm sure I've done things not perfect, and I'm sure I will do things in the future not perfect, but I will work. I am committed to doing better and to learning. And to me, that's the joy of it. Like when younger people started to approach me around TGNC identities and really kind of be like, hey, I'm non-gender conforming and I use they, them, theirs, and I was like, I love it. Because as a young queer, I never liked the binary. And part of it was really and while I'd mostly dated men, and I would say I primarily identify certainly with male partners, I don't consider myself somebody like, like, I don't know what they say, Kinsey 6 or whatever. Like the idea that I would fall in love with anyone of a different gender or the same gender is just, to me, about who I connect with. And I think that logic was just such a critical piece to who I was. And I think in terms of gender identity, I think certainly I'm grateful for the kind of leaders and voices and friends and colleagues that I have in community who are very helpful, giving me, again, more insight into, really thinking about my own experience and where do I fall and what do I love and what am I comfortable with? How much of it is, again, kind of stuck in this rooted in this transphobic kind of narrative that I have to kind of, work my way out of. And again, I don't consider myself overtly transphobic, but I'm sure I perpetuate numerous oppressive things throughout the process. Like I live in a world that is, oppressive, and I have to own that, in the way that I live a world that's colonial, and I can't get out of that global like damage that I'm sure I perpetuate with every pair, with everything of toothpaste I buy. So it doesn't excuse me from doing the work, but I think it gives me the humility to say, look, I am not free of this responsibility. How do I manage to continue to learn? And I think for people who are looking to learn more, listening to transgender voices is a great place to start. There are so many wonderful authors out there. There are so many people who are out there wanting and willing to share their stories with you as a form of education, especially through books or videos or whatever. In person's always good too, but it helps to ask them first. And not every person of an identity wants to be your teacher. So do the work by finding people who have made themselves available to do that through, again, books. There's plenty of different channels to go. But I think you have to approach the conversation from a place of humility and say, I will never know myself as concretely as I think I do. and that is a good place to open that conversation, and because people of transgender experience, that is a very personal discovery. It's a very personal place to be. It's a very personal place of identification. And if you are not in a place to be open to what that internal conversation, that sort of discovery, the conflict individuals feel when they are, biologically live in a body that's very different from the gender identity that they may feel or wish to express, like, to create that separation, you have to be in a place to understand that those things can live within all of us at some level, and we just don't think about them. Like, I live in a world where I don't have to think about my whiteness, and I don't think about my maleness, I don't think about it at all. And so to give me a moment to sort of think about it, that's work, and that's work that people have to do.
I want to go back on a couple of things that you had mentioned that I think is important, like, because I think at least the major takeaways I got from that was this recognition about sort of the culture and environment that we're in. A colleague of mine had this, she majored in TV production and media, and there was this sort of philosophical question she was given and had to think through was, does real life make the media, or does media make the real life? And it's like a chicken and egg conversation, yeah, everyone in the United States of America, citizen or non-citizen, we have all been touched or affected in some capacity about Puritan, colonial, Eurocentric culture is embedded in some aspect of us, whether it's in our fashion, our philosophy, our religious views, and so on and so forth. So I think it sounds like the major takeaways, let's just kind of recognize that, going back to what you said before about intersectionality, how things are all connected, and also just participate. And it sounds like participating in the support, participation as a whole helps you gain that understanding about how things are connected. So I think about these things because the next thing I want to ask was, how can North Carolinians be better allies? And I think you hinted on it, which is really change the culture or build the environment where we can tell our own narrative, so to speak, and not have someone speak for us or speak onto us a narrative. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think there's a few things you could do locally. I think, thank you for sharing that. I think that's true. Obviously, again, the more authentic, the more authentic you can share your voice, the better. Again, that sort of suggests an openness of space, but also the more you listen to other voices, I think is one of the most important things, right? Like, and really encouraging to go and listen to other voices, not just voices that Facebook suggests into your feed, but like actually going, well, I would like to learn more about this. I would like to go listen to someone who wants to speak on this. I'd like to attend a virtual panel that talks about this particular area, and this is something that's interesting to me, and I want to sit back and I want to listen, and I might have some questions and I can add those to the chat, but that I'm willing to sort of go and like this may not directly impact my life. Like maybe I'm someone who doesn't know, or at least know someone who's maybe disclosed to them their transgender identity, or I'm not confronted on a daily basis with this conversation, but I would like to know and understand a little bit more about individuals' experience, individuals' transgender experience, as well as the different successes and joys and barriers and challenges and everything that goes with it, right? Like, we always often talk about like it's only about barriers, but it's not. It's also joys, and it's wonderful. And there are, again, I think it's important we always insert joy into that conversation too, because that is a critical part to everybody's life. And so making sure that people are listening to that, I think, is really critical. And you have to seek it out. Like, I think people wait for stuff to drop on their doorstep. They kind of do a thing. I think if you're a white person, I think, again, it was really helpful. A lot of the Black Lives Matter conversations were really helpful for you. I hope they were helpful for you. I know they were helpful for me. I meant you broadly, but yes, also you. Like, I think they're helpful for everyone, but like helpful for everyone, broadly to kind of, go and read How to Be Anti-Racist, which is again a really strong book, and to go read other books that were having some of these conversations that are built on a bedrock that is decades and decades and decades and decades and decades of work that people who have been trying to be heard needed to hear. And so that it came into fashion to have that conversation is great. And I think with transgender identities, transgender non-binary identities, and gender non-conforming identities, I think it's really important that, they're the effort, it's the work. So people in North Carolina can do that. Whether it's through their local LGBTQ centers. So again, I think the LGBTQ Center of Durham, I'm just gonna give them a woo, because their commitment and work and dedication to centering trans voices, but also centering people of color, has just been, I think, almost without parallel in North Carolina, and I think it's worth recognizing that. I think Charlotte is doing well. Winston-Salem has a great program called North Star, which is also doing really well. And even if you're not somebody who identifies on the queer spectrum, I think it's worth, like, again, linking into these conversations in the way that I think it's worth linking in conversations about race and gender, and all of these conversations, to make sure that you're kind of aware and that you're learning, you're being a better citizen. Like, I guess that to me is like, people are like, I'm going to be a better person. Well, if you want to be a better person, then you have to learn. And some of that learning comes with recognizing that you didn't know stuff before, or that you didn't know you were doing stuff wrong, or recognizing that it changes on you. In the trans community particularly, there are a lot of internal conversations, because it is a movement that is itself evolving in different ways. And part of that is its recognition around what non-binary means, and sort of its own relationship to historical terms, which have been sometimes oppressive, sometimes been used as insults and stuff like that. And so how those get reincorporated, I love the term queer, but even among gay people, it would be a good parallel to say, some older people don't like queer. I love it, still my favorite.
Sorry, I wanted to kind of hone in on that, because I think to your very point about this, like how things change up on you, I think that's a great example. And I think that's always fascinating, because for me, I prefer the term fluid. For me, it's a new word. To me, it makes sense. It encompasses everything. And I feel like that's kind of what the whole spectrum is about. There's this book called Understanding Sexuality in the 21st Century, and it talks a lot of what you're talking about, with younger generations sort of redefining or challenging the norms that were sort of preset, and kind of expanding on what's there. But yeah, I kind of wanted to hear how come you like the word queer? What's your personal affinity with it?
I think, like I said, I came out around 17, and then I was in college, and I went to a school in Iowa, as a private school, so I got a luxury of a really nice education in that way. And so there were a lot of, it's a lot of navel gazing and theorizing and stuff. But we also got, one of the first gay theology professors in the country. And we also got, I had professors who in 1990, is how old I am, right? 1992, 1988 to 92 is when I was in college, right? 1992 to 96. Oh my gosh, how old am I? I don't remember. Anyways, somewhere in there, I think it's 92 to 96. It wasn't, queer theory it really only had lived in some of the Ivy League schools. And so it was just trying to sort of seep out into these other areas. And queer theory was just as soon as I learned it, I was like, that's me. I, even coming to my queerness or gay identity or this, I always felt like there was so much more versatility in the way that people's lives unfolded, that they weren't the same person from here to there. And I'm not, again, you can have consistency. I think there are many things in my life that are very consistent, but I think that sexual identity and sexual and gender expression and transgender identity, all of these things, these are calling into question things that were taken as this is the way it is. And I think even as I was coming into my gay sexuality, or gayness, I always had trouble, because in order for a lot of gay men to sort of reinforce their gayness, they would often diminish the presence of women, or put them at such a plasticity, they weren't real. I mean, we oftentimes talked about sort of women as sort of the accompaniment. Women were always present in gay environments, but they were never allowed their own sexual identities oftentimes. There were, we love to perform as women, but yet when gay men would talk about women in any meaningful way, like having depth or emotion or any of that, it was just maligned in such a grotesque and just like you say the word vagina, and gay men would get visibly nauseated. And I was like, why? If you're not interested, why? I don't understand the necessity, like if you're not interested, it's cool. Like I'm not interested in sports, but I don't get visibly nauseated when somebody comes up and be like, you want to go to a baseball game? No, like I don't care. But I think what I was so fascinated by was we had so much investment in the reinforcement of who we were. And again, that's in relationship to an environment that was homophobic, that real people were killing themselves. And so that need to reinforce, I'm empathetic to why it's there, but the damage it does is significant. And I think it's worth all of us, again, thinking about how people have reinforced transphobic environments and environments that are hostile, because we're looking to reinforce ourselves. Like again, I think it comes back to that humility and be like, oh, we're uncomfortable because this might cause us to think that our masculinity is somehow not this weird ironclad, plaid thing. Like I don't understand that. And I think queerness to me was this recognition that queer is an all-encompassing term. Because even the Latin word torquere, which I love, is really to bend. And as someone who believes that, whether it's economic justice or racial justice, that we cannot continue in the line we're on. We have to bend it, because the line we're on only serves somebody like me in so many different ways. And if we don't bend it, if we're not looking at different ways to approach this, if we're not creating alternate paths, if we're not deviating from the trajectory that is a history of oppression and damage and harm, then we're not doing it right. And so to me, like queerness was a celebration of like, there is a much wider, like amazing, diverse array of paths, like a network. I get all weird and like fabric and weave and anyways, whatever. Like,
keep going.
Give us chili oil and dance around the stage, whatever. But like, it's not my thing. So, but this idea of a just wider, more expansive version of self, that didn't require that I define these pieces. Like I love whom I'm in love with, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of their class, their race, all of these things. These are all things. Now, again, we can get into a bigger debate about like, am I still influenced by the majority narratives and all that? Sure. But like this idea of queer was to say, I have this panoply of places that I can live and explore myself and be in this world. And they all demand dignity, every single one. So whether you are in a monogamous relationship or single or poly or queer or non-binary or, whatever, like you deserve, and as a human being, you deserve dignity. We could talk about behavior, right? Like if you kill someone, that's a problem. Like there's different things there. But your identity, who you are, deserves dignity. And where you're at deserves dignity. And I think that part of queerness is something I was like, yes. Like all this conversation about like these, even among these gay men who are just being so just terribly misogynist about so many different things, like they need this lesson. This is important. And so, I just took to queerness very early on. To me, it was just something that just captured, I think, as young people have started to adapt and adopt more of that philosophy among my peers. Sometimes they're like, I don't know that I get the pronoun. And I'm like, I get it. I'm all on board. I'm like, and is it going to net out? Like, are we going to feel the same way about pronouns in 10 years? I don't know. I hope that at the minimum, pronoun usage and things like that force us to rethink gender assumptions, that they force us to reconsider a lot of our practices which have been gendered, oftentimes, I would say, blindly accepted. Are these protocols going to be the same in 10 years? I don't know. I mean, I'm fine with it. Like, I'm good with it. But I know many of people my age and older, some have been very uncomfortable with it. Some have not adapted to it particularly well. And I think that's the same with queer. I think early on queer, a lot of gay people really hated it. There's still an older contingent of gay people who still feel, again, because partially it was used as a derogatory term. Although historically, if you look at it, I still love it. Like it's still this sort of like things that were queer were like things that were unusual and strange. And I'm like, yes, We're all unusual. Like, I don't care how much you want to fit into the, the norm of things. You don't. Like, all of your idiosyncrasies, all of your strangenesses, all of that one big toe that's slightly bigger than the other one, that's you. You're still queer. You're still, and I think you can be straight and married and with, with kids and still be queer if you understand your own humility about where you're at, and that you have this sort of non-fixed place, but that you choose kind of where you're at, and that other people who choose differently deserve dignity and deserve to be where they're at, and that's okay. And I think that to me is just something that I very much embraced.
I really appreciate that. Honestly, that could easily answer my last question, because the last question I only have was, what message, divines God divines, all forbid that, our society gets wiped and all that's left are like our hard drives or something, and people look into our history and our records and stories. What would be the thing that you would want, or even centuries from now? Let's think more positively. Let's say centuries from now, as we grow and continue to evolve as life, and someone finds this and looks back at where we were in this time, what message would you have for them, or statement?
Wow, that's a tough one. I firmly believe, and I don't think I would have done this work for as long as I've done it. I believe human beings are capable of great compassion. Now, it's not the same thing as pity, and I think it's a very careful thing as an activist that you are careful to not make that the conversation. I do not feel pity in the same way, and often I feel compassion. I think people make difficult choices, and oftentimes people don't get the options of choices in front of them. And I think, to me, people are capable of incredible compassion and incredible care. And I think that's always what I've looked at as an activist. How do you facilitate care? How do you make fractures into that certainty that people have about the world so that they can start to understand the humanity and what is that all people are worthy of dignity? Like, I think that, this Trump era and this whole period has certainly, given speed to the fundamental divisions that have been there around race and gender and so many of these things for so long, and it gave a new language to affirm many of those bigotries and prejudices, and I don't like it. And one of the things that I was most passionate about trying to do initially, when and even actually all the way through this process, has been, how do you create fractures, right? Like, I think when people learn who other people are, it is hard to hate them. Like, I'm not saying we can't, somebody cuts us off in traffic, we could totally have that moment of like, oh, but to hate people, to wish their pain and suffering, to wish them to suffer, that is something that I think we can get beyond. I really do believe that. I think that the thing in this moment is we have seen people come together in different forms of compassion and different forms of unity. And at the same time, like, it's on a parallel sort of track, we've seen this amplification of division in so many different ways. And is some of it, due to the media itself? It's possible, and certainly. But, again, I think history teaches us a lot. This isn't the first time we have created populations and maligned them to the corners and used media or other forms to create oppression. So, our technology's changed. I don't know that our behavior has changed as much as I wish it did. So if somebody were watching this in 200, 300 years, my hope is that they have learned something, that we aren't repeating the same cycles over and over again, and that we learn, I want to say love, and love seems very, again, I'm not as Woodstocky, I guess, as I sound sometimes. I think compassion. I think at the end of the day, I think humans are capable of enormous compassion, but we have to learn. We have to learn, and then I think the best term I've learned over the last couple of years, 2-3 years, and I still love it, is cultural humility. And I'm not able to credit the source, and I wish I could. But it is something that I think as a term, as a concept, I think has been really helpful to articulate something that I already kind of felt at some level, but really helped me give a context to it. And it is that sense of humility that has to come to the conversation, that it's not about being right. It's not, there is no rightness. There is no certainty for any population, whether you're oppressed or not. What you can do, though, is identify where you're causing that suffering, where you're causing that harm, and you can address it. Like you can do better because you care about doing better. And I think I'd like to believe that in 200 to 300, 400 years, if we're still around and the cockroaches aren't the one watching this, that might be the case. That we've done better.
Thank you so much, Shane. I share very similar sentiments, and so it's very inspiring. So that was pretty much all I had for this. And so again, I just want to thank you again for your time, for your effort, for your continued support. And if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. Be happy to help.
You're amazing. Thank you. Thank you for working on this project, bringing this project to light. You're a force. I love that you're out there in collaboration and community across a diverse array of communities, and that you're really trying to sort of lift this up. So, and you've listened to me prattle on for forever. So, I thank you for that too. Thank you for letting me do that. Again, you're a gift. I appreciate you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with you this morning.
All right. Thank you. Let me go ahead and end the recording.